My name is Alice. I'm in my late 20s now, but this story begins when I was 27. Old enough to know better, young enough to believe loyalty still counted for something. At the time, I worked inside a fast growing company where people like to describe me as dependable, quiet, low maintenance. The kind of person managers forget to worry about. The kind of person colleagues assume will always stay. Most people underestimate me in a very specific way. They think silence means agreement. They think calm means harmless. They think that if someone doesn't interrupt the room, she isn't tracking every detail inside it. I've learned that when people feel safe overlooking you, they reveal more than they intend to. Not secrets in the dramatic sense, nothing whispered in hallways, but patterns, habits, assumptions. That's where this story lives. This is not a revenge story. There are no villains twirling, no shouting matches, no dramatic exits. There is no moment where I stand up and tell everyone exactly how wrong they were. What happened instead was quieter, slower, and far more permanent. The title alone makes people flinch. I sold my team's secrets to a competitor for $50,000 at 27. And I understand why. It sounds reckless. It sounds cold. It sounds like betrayal for profit. But titles don't carry context, and they don't explain the months and years of decisions that came before that moment. They also don't explain the sentence that matters more to me now. Loyalty didn't pay my bills. Silence did. This story is about how loyalty is often rewarded with expectation, not protection. About how being the reliable one can slowly turn into being the expendable one. It's about how disrespect rarely arrives loudly. It comes in small cuts that don't bleed enough to alarm anyone else. And it's about how silence, when chosen deliberately, can become leverage rather than loss. Over the next chapters, I'll walk you through who I was inside that company, how I learned the role I was expected to play, and how I stopped trying to correct it. You'll hear about the moment something shifted internally, long before anything changed on the outside. You'll hear how preparation looks when it isn't fueled by anger, and how decisions feel when they're made without applause. I'm not here to justify myself, and I'm not here to ask forgiveness. I'm here to tell the truth as cleanly as I can, without dramatizing pain or glamorizing consequences. Some of you will disagree with what I did. Some of you will recognize parts of yourself in the earlier version of me. Both reactions are welcome. So, before we begin, let me ask you something gently and honestly. Have you ever been loyal to a system that was quietly training you to be invisible? Inside the company, I was known, but not in the way people usually mean when they say that. I wasn't memorable. I was familiar. I existed in the background of meetings, in shared documents, in forwarded emails that solved problems quietly before they became problems at all. If you asked my manager to describe me, he would have said I was solid, reliable, someone who didn't need hand-holding, someone who could be trusted to pick up loose ends. If you asked my teammates, they might have said I was helpful, maybe even indispensable, though they would never use that word out loud. Indispensability makes people uncomfortable. It implies obligation. I didn't have a dramatic job title. I wasn't the visionary or the closer or the loud strategist. I coordinated, I translated. I remembered things other people forgot they'd promised. I made sure information moved cleanly between departments that barely spoke to each other. When something broke, I usually knew why. When something worked, no one asked how. There's a particular kind of invisibility that comes with being competent and calm at the same time. If you complain, people label you difficult. If you stay quiet, they assume you're fine. I was very good at seeming fine. I arrived early and left on time. Not late enough to look overworked, not early enough to look disengaged. I took notes no one else took. I summarized meetings for people who didn't attend. I fixed inconsistencies in product documentation before clients noticed them. When leadership praised the team, my name was included collectively, safely diluted. No one was cruel to me. That's important to say. There were no raised voices, no public humiliations, no obvious antagonists. What existed instead was an assumption. The assumption that I would always be there, that I didn't need growth conversations because I wasn't going anywhere, that I didn't need protection because I wasn't a risk. I became the person people leaned on without checking whether I could still stand straight. In meetings, ideas I introduced gently would resurface later, louder, with someone else's confidence attached to them. I told myself that was just how collaboration worked, when decisions were made without looping me in. Even when they affected systems I managed, I told myself leadership was busy. When promotions went to people who created visibility more than value, I told myself timing mattered. I was loyal in small, quiet ways. I defended the company when friends criticized long hours. I stayed late when launches slipped. I absorbed stress so others didn't have to. I believed that if I kept my head down and my work clean, someone would eventually notice the pattern. But the truth is, they noticed something else entirely. They noticed I didn't make a noise. I didn't threaten to leave. I didn't posture. I didn't escalate. I didn't create friction in a system that rewards urgency and volume, that made me safe. And safety, I learned, is not the same as value. Over time, my role became less about contribution and more about containment. I was there to stabilize, to absorb overflow, to quietly correct misalignment. I wasn't seen as someone with a trajectory. I was seen as infrastructure, and infrastructure is only discussed when it fails. I don't say this with bitterness. At the time, I was proud of being trusted, proud of being the one who could handle complexity without needing applause. I believed loyalty was a long game. I believed consistency would compound. What I didn't understand yet was that consistency without boundaries doesn't compound. It settles. It sinks into the floorboards of an organization, invisible until someone tries to remove it and everything starts to creak. Back then, I still thought silence was neutral. I hadn't learned yet that silence is read as consent and sometimes as permission. That understanding came later. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. That's the thing about small cuts. They don't announce themselves. They don't demand reaction. They don't even hurt much at first. They just register somewhere in the body. A brief sting, easy to dismiss if you're already carrying other weight. It was during a planning meeting for a product update I had been coordinating for weeks. I'd mapped dependencies, flagged risks, and documented edge cases no one else had time to think about. The meeting itself was crowded, too many voices, too little focus. When my turn came, I explained a potential conflict between two rollout timelines. I wasn't dramatic about it. I wasn't trying to stop momentum. I just wanted the room to see what I was seeing. My manager nodded, said, "Let's circle back," and moved on. 10 minutes later, someone else more senior, louder, raised the same concern, used different words, spoke with certainty instead of caution. The room paused. Heads nodded. Someone said, "That's a good catch." Another person started brainstorming solutions. No one acknowledged that the point had already been made. I told myself it didn't matter. The issue was addressed. That was the goal, right? I reminded myself I wasn't there for credit. I was there for outcomes. Still, I wrote a small note in my notebook afterward, not accusatory, just factual. Concern raised, ignored, reintroduced, accepted. It didn't feel like a betrayal, it felt like a data point. A few weeks later, there was a reallocation of responsibilities. A project I had been managing end to end was reassigned to balance workload. That phrase again, reasonable, neutral, hard to argue with. The handoff meeting was brief. My role was reduced to support. When I asked what prompted the change, my manager smiled and said, "You're flexible. You can adapt." Flexible. That word sounds like praise until you realize it's often used to justify extraction. I didn't protest. I didn't want to seem territorial. I told myself leadership had a broader view. Still, I noticed that the person taking over had less context and more visibility. Their questions came to me privately. Their updates went to leadership publicly. Another note in the notebook: responsibility transferred, accountability blurred. None of this was egregious enough to escalate. That was the problem. Each moment existed in isolation, defensible on its own. No one else reacted because no one else felt the accumulation. From the outside, everything looked normal. From the inside, something was thinning. The real cut came later during a performance check-in. It wasn't even a formal review, just a casual conversation my manager initiated at the end of the day. He told me I was doing well, that I was dependable, that the team appreciated my consistency. Then he paused, like he was choosing his words carefully, and said, "One thing to work on is visibility. Sometimes leadership doesn't know everything you're contributing." I remember nodding. I remember thanking him for the feedback. What I didn't say was that visibility requires permission, that I had been discouraged, subtly, repeatedly, from taking up space, that every time I spoke too directly, the room shifted away from me. Instead, I asked what he suggested. He said, just speak up more. That was the moment I realized something important. The system was comfortable benefiting from my work without being responsible for my advancement. And when that imbalance was pointed out, however gently, the solution was framed as my personal growth opportunity. I left the office that day feeling unsettled, not angry, confused. I replayed the conversation on the walk home, searching for malice and finding none, just misalignment, just convenience. That night, I opened my notebook again. This time, I wrote more than a sentence. I wrote context, dates, who was in the room, what was said, not because I planned to use it against anyone, but because I wanted to understand whether this was a pattern or just a bad week. Everyone else moved on. I didn't. That was the first small cut. Not because it hurt deeply, but because it taught me to pay attention. Once you notice a pattern, you have two choices. You can interrupt it, or you can explain it away. I chose the second option for longer than I like to admit. After that first small cut, nothing dramatic happened. That would have made things easier. Instead, the same kind of moments kept repeating, quietly, consistently, almost politely. They blended into the rhythm of work so smoothly that calling them out would have felt like overreacting. My responsibilities continued to expand, but my authority didn't. I was asked to just help out on projects that quickly became mine in practice, if not in name. I trained new hires who were introduced as future leads. I was copied on emails when something went wrong and removed when things stabilized. When leadership needed context fast, they came to me. When leadership needed a face for success, they looked elsewhere. I told myself this was temporary. Startups were chaotic. Titles lagged behind reality. Everyone paid their dues. These were the stories I used to soften the edges of what I was experiencing. There was a particular meeting that stands out now. Not because anything extreme happened, but because of how normal it felt at the time. A senior manager questioned a decision I had implemented based on earlier approval. The tone wasn't aggressive, just skeptical. I explained the rationale, referenced the documentation, and even pulled up the email thread where the decision had been greenlit. He waved it off and said, "Let's not get stuck in details." Details. The same details I was responsible for cleaning up later. No one defended me, no one contradicted him. The conversation moved on, and I sat there, hands folded, feeling oddly transparent, like I could see everyone and no one could see me back. Afterward, a colleague messaged me privately. "That was unfair." I typed back, "It's fine." And I meant it, or at least I needed it to be fine. That became my reflex. It's fine, not a big deal. I get why they did that. I was so skilled at contextualizing other people's behavior that I barely noticed I was erasing my own reactions in the process. The company culture praised resilience, but what it rewarded was tolerance. The ability to absorb friction without reflecting it back. I was very good at that. Over time, people stopped checking in with me when decisions were made that affected my work. They assumed I'd adapt. They assumed I wouldn't push back. And because I rarely did, they were right. I normalized the disrespect by treating it as efficiency. Why escalate when I could just fix it? Why correct someone publicly when I could clarify later? Why demand recognition when the work itself mattered more? These questions made me feel mature, evolved, and above office politics. But there's a difference between choosing peace and being trained into silence. I started noticing how often my name was left out of conversations where it belonged. How often was it introduced as support rather than a strategy? How often people assumed my time was available because I never made it scarce. Still, I stayed. Part of it was fear. Subtle, rational fear. The job market was unstable. I had rent, student loans, and responsibilities. Loyalty felt safer than risk. Another part was identity. I had built a sense of self around being the steady one. Walking away felt like failure. And then there was hope. Hope that someone would eventually connect the dots, that leadership would notice the pattern of who held things together, that my silence would be interpreted as strength, not surrender. So I kept documenting, quietly, not as evidence, but as a way to stay grounded. When you write things down, you can't gaslight yourself as easily. You can see repetition. You can see escalation disguised as normalcy. What I didn't realize then was that by normalizing the disrespect externally, I was doing something else internally. I was detaching. Each moment that should have triggered emotion instead triggered observation. I stopped expecting fairness and started studying structure. I paid attention to incentives instead of intentions. I watched who benefited from ambiguity and who bore the cost of clarity. The more I rationalized staying quiet, the less I felt personally involved. And that distance, slow, almost imperceptible, changed the way I related to the company entirely. I was still loyal in action, still reliable, still present. But something in me had shifted from belonging to assessment. At the time, I thought I was being patient. In reality, I was learning. It took me longer than it should have to realize that I wasn't failing to define my role. My role had already been defined for me. Once that clicked, a lot of confusion dissolved. The mixed signals, the stalled growth, the way praise never translated into protection. I wasn't overlooked by accident. I was placed, quietly, efficiently, into a position that served everyone else very well. I was the reliable one, not the rising star, not the future leader, the stabilizer. The person who caught what fell through the cracks and handed it back without asking who dropped it. The role required competence without ambition, loyalty without leverage, and the system reinforced it constantly. When deadlines tightened, my workload increased because I handled pressure well. When others made mistakes, I absorbed the cleanup because I was detail-oriented. When new initiatives were launched, I was included early to build structure, but excluded later when visibility mattered. I wasn't invited into rooms where direction was set. I was invited into rooms where execution was required. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. There was a conversation with my manager that crystallized everything. I asked, calmly, what the path forward looked like for me. Not a demand, not an ultimatum, just a question. He leaned back, thoughtful, and said, "You're incredibly valuable where you are." Where are? Not where you could go, not what you could become. Where are? He meant it as reassurance. I heard it as a ceiling. I realized then that my growth would disrupt a balance that benefited others. Promoting me would mean replacing me, or splitting my responsibilities across people who didn't want them. Keeping me steady kept the machine smooth, so I was encouraged to stay. The role came with unspoken expectations. I would be flexible. I would be available. I would not rock the boat. In return, I would receive stability, verbal appreciation, and the quiet satisfaction of being needed. What I wouldn't receive was advocacy. Advocacy requires someone to see you as an investment, not an asset. Assets are used. Investments grow. I started paying closer attention to how others were positioned. People who spoke confidently, even when they were wrong, were treated as leadership material. People who asked for resources were seen as strategic. People who set boundaries were respected for having them. I had done none of those things. Not because I couldn't, but because I believed my work would speak for me. It did, just not in the language that advanced me. I want to be clear, no one explicitly told me to stay small. No one said I wasn't allowed to want more. The system didn't need to say it. It simply rewarded certain behaviors and ignored others. I adapted accordingly. And adaptation, when repeated long enough, becomes identity. I saw myself the way they saw me. Dependable, supportive, low risk. Someone who would never make a move that forced others to adjust. That's when I understood something uncomfortable. As long as I played this role well, I would never be seen as someone who could disrupt it. So I stopped trying to correct perceptions. I didn't argue for visibility anymore. I didn't volunteer ideas in rooms that didn't listen. I didn't push for inclusion. I focused on execution, on observation, on understanding the full shape of the system I was inside. If I were going to be reliable, I would be precisely that, without emotional attachment. That shift wasn't loud. No one noticed it happening. From the outside, I looked the same, calm, helpful, consistent. Inside, though, I had stopped asking to be chosen. I had started choosing something else. The day something shifted wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no confrontation, no final straw that snapped loudly in half. It was quiet enough that if I hadn't been paying attention, I might have missed it entirely. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, in a meeting I almost didn't attend. I was copied at the last minute, tagged as optional. I went anyway, laptop closed, notebook open. The discussion centered around a strategic partnership, one that would reshape how our product competed in the market. I had been deeply involved in the operational side of the same initiative weeks earlier, though my name wasn't attached to it anymore. As people talked, I realized something unsettling. They didn't fully understand what they were agreeing to. Assumptions were being made about timelines, about data ownership, about integration risks that directly contradicted constraints I had already documented. The room was confident, almost relieved. Decisions were landing quickly. Everyone seemed eager to move on. I waited for someone to ask the obvious questions. No one did. For a moment, my old instinct flared. I could interrupt, clarify, save everyone time later. That was my role after all, the reliable one, the stabilizer. Yeah. But something in me paused. I looked around the room and realized that even if I spoke, the outcome wouldn't change. In the best case, my concerns would be acknowledged and then quietly sidelined. Worst case, I'd be seen as slowing progress. Either way, I would be responsible for cleaning up the consequences. And that's when the shift happened. I didn't feel angry. I felt free. For the first time, I let the silence stand. I wrote everything down. Not just the decision, but the misunderstandings behind it. Who said what? What was assumed? What was missing? The gap between confidence and reality was suddenly very clear. When the meeting ended, no one asked for my input. No one noticed I hadn't spoken. That confirmed something I had been circling for months. My voice wasn't absent, it had simply been made optional. On the walk back to my desk, I felt an unfamiliar calm, not resignation, clarity. I understood then that my effort had been subsidizing other people's certainty. That my silence, when combined with my competence, created a safety net that allowed risky decisions to feel consequence-free. By always intervening, I had been protecting a system that didn't protect me. That afternoon, I made a small internal decision. I would stop preemptively fixing things no one asked me to fix. I would stop volunteering context in rooms that didn't value it. I would do my job, but only the job I was explicitly asked to do. Not out of spite, out of alignment. This wasn't withdrawal, it was recalibration. Over the next few weeks, I noticed how uncomfortable people became without my quiet interventions. Questions went unanswered longer. Follow-ups took more time. Minor issues lingered instead of being smoothed over instantly. No one blamed me. They didn't know what I had been preventing. And I didn't rush to explain. That's when I realized something else. Silence, when chosen consciously, isn't absence. It's a boundary. And boundaries change dynamics, whether or not they're announced. I became more selective with my energy. I documented instead of correcting. I observed instead of reacting. I stopped offering solutions in advance and waited to be asked. Internally, the shift was profound. I stopped measuring my worth by how indispensable I was. I started measuring my position by how informed I was. Knowledge, I realized, accumulates power quietly, especially when others assume you're not using it. The system hadn't changed, but my relationship to it had. That day didn't look important from the outside. If you asked anyone else when things started to go wrong, they'd point to a much later moment. But for me, that afternoon was the beginning. It was the moment I stopped trying to be seen and started seeing clearly. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been reactive, a byproduct of not wanting to cause friction, not wanting to be misunderstood, not wanting to seem difficult. Now it was deliberate, measured, almost careful. I wasn't retreating, I was repositioning. From the outside, nothing about me looked different. I still showed up on time. I still delivered what was asked. I still responded politely, promptly, and professionally. If anything, I appeared more composed than ever. That's why no one noticed. People tend to believe silence means compliance, when it fits the story they already want to tell. In my case, the story was that I was steady, agreeable, and non-threatening. My new restraint reinforced that narrative perfectly. What changed was what I stopped doing. I stopped filling in gaps that weren't mine to fill. I stopped translating vague directions into executable plans without being asked. I stopped flagging risks in advance for people who had repeatedly ignored them. If someone wanted my perspective, they had to request it explicitly. Most didn't. At first, this felt uncomfortable, almost negligent. I had been trained to equate value with intervention. Watching small issues drift unresolved triggered old habits. But I reminded myself, this was not about withholding help. It was about aligning effort with accountability. Silence, I learned, reveals ownership. When you stop cushioning decisions, the weight of them becomes visible. People began to mistake my quiet for disengagement. A colleague joked that I was mysteriously zen lately. Another asked if everything was okay. I smiled and said yes, because it was. For the first time in a long while, my internal state matched my external behavior. I was calm because I wasn't carrying what wasn't mine. Meanwhile, I was paying attention. I listened closely in meetings, not for what was said, but for what was assumed. I noted where confidence exceeded evidence. I tracked how often decisions relied on information I knew to be incomplete or incorrect. I kept documenting, not emotionally, not defensively, methodically. Patterns emerged quickly when I stopped interrupting them. I saw how much institutional knowledge lived with me alone, how often people deferred to my past work without understanding it, how rarely anyone verified assumptions as long as outcomes seemed fine. And I saw something else too, how expendable I was assumed to be. Because I didn't assert power, no one attributed any to me. Because I didn't seek recognition, no one imagined I might seek leverage. My silence reassured them that I wasn't playing any game. That misunderstanding became my greatest advantage. I wasn't planning anything yet. There was no master scheme. Just clarity. A growing awareness that loyalty, in this environment, functioned like a one-way mirror. I could see in. They couldn't see me. I began thinking more pragmatically about my future, about savings, about market value, about how little security verbal appreciation actually provides. I reviewed my finances with the same detachment I reviewed meeting notes. That's when the phrase formed in my mind. Not dramatically, not bitterly, just plain. Loyalty didn't pay my bills. It wasn't an accusation, it was an observation. And silence, my silence, was giving me something loyalty never had. Time. Time to understand the system fully. Time to assess my options without pressure. Time to decide what I was willing to trade and for what. People often think silence is passive. That means waiting. In my case, it meant choosing not to reveal my position until I understood it completely. By the time anyone realized I'd stopped overfunctioning, it felt normal. They adapted, or rather, they assumed someone else would. That assumption carried weight, and I was learning exactly how heavy it was. What they never noticed was how much I was learning while they assumed I had stopped caring. When you're quiet and competent, people talk freely around you. They don't lower their voices. They don't obscure their reasoning. They explain things casually, assuming you're just there to support, not to synthesize. I listened the way analysts listen, without interruption, without reaction, without revealing what I was connecting. I learned how decisions actually got made, which was rarely how they were presented. I learned which metrics mattered in public and which ones mattered in private. I learned which partnerships were performative and which ones were existential. I learned where the company cut corners, not out of malice, but out of momentum. And most importantly, I learned how fragile the narrative of competence really was. My role gave me access to systems that no one thought twice about granting me. Documentation repositories, historical roadmaps, internal wikis that no one updated but everyone referenced. I maintained them, which meant I understood not just what they contained, but what they implied. I started organizing information in a way the company didn't. I mapped dependencies across teams, not for a presentation, for myself. I tracked how often external commitments were made before internal feasibility was checked. I noted where proprietary workflows overlapped with vendor contracts. I saw where best practices were actually undocumented habits passed down informally. None of this required hacking or secrecy. It required attention. Because I had been there long enough, I held institutional memory that others lacked. I remembered why decisions had been made, not just what was decided. When people left, their context left with them. Mine stayed. I also noticed how often leadership relied on my past work without consulting me in the present. Old documents, old frameworks, old assumptions. They treated them as stable, finished things. They weren't. They were living systems that required care. I stopped updating them, not destructively. I didn't sabotage anything. I simply stopped preemptively aligning them with new realities unless asked. The knowledge stayed accurate, but unrefreshed, subtly aging. Meanwhile, I began preparing in ways that looked like self-development from the outside. I updated my resume quietly. I researched industry standards. I compared salaries, not aspirationally, but realistically. I took notes on how competitors positioned similar products, what they emphasized, what they hid. At night, I read contracts, not just ours, but public ones. I learned the language of liability and disclosure. I understood what counted as proprietary and what counted as operational insight, where lines existed, where they didn't. Still no plan, just positioning. What surprised me most was how no one checked in. No one asked what I was working on long term. No one asked how I saw my future at the company. My silence had been interpreted as contentment, and contentment had been interpreted as permanence. That assumption allowed me to move freely. I wasn't acting against the company. I was acting for myself, something I had postponed for years. And the more I learned, the clearer it became how asymmetrical the relationship had been all along. The company had redundancy everywhere, except where I sat. That wasn't arrogance, it was a structural fact. I knew which data pipelines were brittle, which partner relationships were held together by trust rather than documentation, which internal processes existed only because I remembered how to run them. No one had ever asked me to transfer that knowledge. They assumed it would always be there. I didn't feel powerful realizing this. I felt sober. Power, I learned, isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It sits quietly in places people don't think to secure. And I was sitting in one of those places. Still, I didn't act, not yet. Knowing something and using it are very different decisions. I needed to understand what kind of person I was willing to be before I crossed that line. So I kept watching, learning, documenting for myself, not for them. What they never noticed was that the same woman they believed to be invisible had become the most informed person in the room. And that knowledge, once fully assembled, doesn't stay neutral forever. The realization didn't arrive with adrenaline. It arrived with stillness. I was sitting alone one evening, reviewing notes I had accumulated over months, timestamps, decision trails, dependency maps, meeting summaries. What I saw wasn't a scandal or a smoking gun. It was something quieter and more consequential. I had leverage. Not leverage in the cinematic sense. No threat, no exposure, no chaos. What I had was clarity about how value actually moved through the company, and how much of that movement depended on knowledge that lived with me. I hadn't planned to discover it. I had simply been paying attention long enough for the shape of it to emerge. The company believed its advantage was innovation, speed, culture, but underneath that story was a less glamorous truth: continuity, processes that worked because someone remembered how they were built, partnerships that functioned because expectations were managed informally, systems that stayed compliant because edge cases were handled quietly before they escalated. I knew which of those systems were robust and which were fragile. I knew which insights were transferable and which were not. And I knew very clearly what the market would pay for understanding that difference. This wasn't about exposing trade secrets or betraying trust recklessly. It was about recognizing that operational intelligence, when abstracted and anonymized, had value beyond the walls it was created in. I took a step back and asked myself hard questions. What exactly did I know? How had I learned it? What did I owe? To the company, to myself, to the people who had trusted me without protecting me. I reviewed contracts carefully. I reread confidentiality clauses, not with fear, but with precision. I differentiated between proprietary assets and experiential insight, between documents I didn't own and the understanding I had earned. The more carefully I looked, the clearer the boundaries became. What I held wasn't a list of secrets. It was a pattern library, a map of mistakes and workarounds, a deep understanding of what not to do and why. That kind of knowledge doesn't belong to a single organization forever. It belongs to the person who lived it. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider an uncomfortable thought. What if staying silent had already cost me more than leaving ever could? I didn't feel triumphant. I felt calm, almost detached, the kind of calm that comes when uncertainty collapses into options. I made no announcements. I didn't hint at dissatisfaction. I didn't test the waters with leadership. I simply acknowledged privately that the balance had shifted. There was a moment, small but definitive, when I closed my notebook and understood that I could leave without asking permission. Not dramatically, not angrily, just cleanly. I also understood something else. If I acted emotionally, I would lose control of the narrative. If I acted quietly, deliberately, I could choose my consequences instead of inheriting them. So I slowed down even more. I organized my thoughts into frameworks, generalizable, non-identifying. I stripped away names and timelines until what remained was pure structure. I asked myself whether I could explain these insights without referencing where they came from. I could. That was the final confirmation. This wasn't a moment of celebration. It was a moment of responsibility. Power, once recognized, demands restraint before action. I needed to decide what kind of exit aligned with my values, not what would shock the system, but what would correct an imbalance that had been normalized for too long. I didn't hate the company. I didn't wish it harm. I simply refused to keep subsidizing a structure that had already decided my place within it. That night I slept well, not because I had made a plan, but because I had finally acknowledged the truth. I wasn't trapped. I was positioned. Once you see your options clearly, not choosing becomes a choice in itself. That was the space I was in. Quiet, unpressured, and fully aware that whatever I did next would set a direction I couldn't easily reverse. There was no urgency imposed from the outside, no deadline, no ultimatum, just the weight of knowing that staying would mean continuing a pattern I now understood too well. I laid out my options the way I laid out everything else. Calmly, honestly, without romance. Option 1 was to stay and renegotiate internally, ask for recognition, advocate for a new role, translate my invisible contributions into visible value. This was the option people like to believe in, the fair system corrected by clear communication. But I had to be honest with myself. I had already communicated indirectly and directly for years. The structure wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed. Renegotiation would require others to acknowledge their dependence on me and then change it. That kind of change doesn't happen without resistance. Option 2 was to leave quietly, find a new role elsewhere, start fresh, carry my experience forward without looking back. This option appealed to my desire for clean lines and minimal conflict, but it came with a cost I couldn't ignore. Leaving silently would mean absorbing the full loss of my undercompensation, my unrecognized expertise, my years of asymmetrical loyalty. The company would feel my absence eventually, but I would feel the gap immediately. Option 3 was the one I circled without naming it first. It involved acknowledging that the knowledge I carried had present, concrete value, and that value didn't have to be deferred to some hypothetical future employer. It could be exchanged now on terms I defined, within boundaries I respected. This wasn't about punishment. It wasn't about exposing anyone. It was about translation. I asked myself a final set of questions, the hardest ones. Would this harm people who didn't deserve it? Would this violate my own moral code? Would I still recognize myself afterward? The answers mattered more than legality or optics. I wasn't interested in causing damage. I wasn't interested in spectacle. I wanted equilibrium. I wanted to exit a system that had benefited disproportionately from my restraint, without continuing to pay for that restraint on the way out. The decision clarified slowly, like fog lifting. I would not confront. I would not threaten. I would not explain myself prematurely. I would move in silence. The competitor wasn't chosen impulsively. It was a company I had studied for months, one whose public struggles mirrored internal conversations I had lived through. I understood their gaps the way I understood my own company's blind spots, not because I had access to secrets, but because I had lived inside the same structural patterns. When I reached out, it wasn't framed as betrayal, it was framed as consulting. Strategic insight, operational lessons learned, no names, no documents, no timelines. Just understanding. The number, $50,000, didn't feel sensational when it was offered. It felt precise, like a market correcting itself quietly. I didn't negotiate aggressively. I didn't feel the need to. This wasn't about extracting maximum value. It was about confirming that value existed at all. When I agreed, it wasn't with excitement. It was with resolve. I understood that once I crossed this line, I couldn't pretend I was simply overlooked anymore. I would be choosing myself, openly, even if no one else ever knew. And that mattered. I closed my notebook that night with a sense of finality I hadn't felt before. Not relief, not fear. Alignment. Whatever came next, I would no longer be subsidizing invisibility. Once the decision was made, I became meticulous, not secretive in a dramatic way. just precise. I separated emotion from execution and treated the next phase like any other complex project. Define scope, confirm boundaries, minimize noise. I reviewed my employment agreement again, line by line. I didn't rush. I noted what was restricted and what wasn't. I reminded myself that understanding systems, patterns, and lessons learned is not the same as transferring proprietary material. I stayed well inside that line. Clarity was protection. I scheduled the consulting sessions outside work hours. No overlap, no shortcuts. I documented what I shared in neutral language, abstracted and generalized. I focused on why certain decisions failed and how to avoid those failures, not on who made them or when. Names never entered the room. Documents never left my possession. From the outside, my life looked unchanged. I still joined stand-ups. I still responded to messages. I still delivered on tasks. I didn't suddenly withdraw or signal departure. If anything, my consistency reassured people. They saw continuity where I felt closure. Internally, I created buffers. I saved aggressively. I updated professional profiles quietly. I identified roles that valued the kind of work I actually did, not just the title I held. I prepared references, people who knew my impact, not just my demeanor. No one noticed any of this. That's the advantage of moving without announcing intention. There's no resistance when no one feels threatened. Silence doesn't provoke scrutiny, it invites assumption. And the assumption, in my case, was that I would continue as I always had. The consulting work itself was straightforward. A few sessions, clear objectives, respectful boundaries. I wasn't there to win anything, just to translate experience into insight. The value was obvious to them, which confirmed something I had already accepted. My work had always been valuable. It had just been undervalued where I was. I didn't feel giddy when the payment cleared. I felt steady. The number wasn't life-changing, but it was symbolic. It represented recognition without negotiation, compensation without performance theater, exchange without pretense. Meanwhile, inside my company, small frictions began to surface. Nothing catastrophic, just delays, confusion about handoffs, questions that circled longer than they used to. People started asking for context. They assumed they lived somewhere else. Meetings extended, follow-ups multiplied. Still, no one connected the dots. I didn't step in to fix things early. I waited to be asked. When I was asked, I answered narrowly, accurately, without volunteering extra context. I wasn't withholding, I was respecting the scope for the first time. What surprised me was how quickly the system adjusted to my reduced intervention. Not smoothly, but acceptably. People compensated, workarounds emerged, the machine didn't stop. And that was important. It confirmed that I wasn't indispensable in the way fear imagines. I was influential in the way systems reveal themselves only after you step back. I finalized my exit timeline quietly. No ultimatums, no grand explanations, just a clear internal countdown. Each day felt lighter, not because I was escaping, but because I was no longer performing loyalty for its own sake. By the time I drafted my resignation, I had already emotionally left. Not bitterly, cleanly. I was still respectful, still professional, just finished. Silence had done its work. It had given me room to move without friction, without spectacle, without asking for permission to protect my own future. And the consequences, though not yet visible, were already in motion. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They never do. They came in the form of small disruptions, subtle enough to dismiss individually, noticeable only when they started to overlap. A missed dependency here, a delayed response there. A meeting was rescheduled because the right context wasn't available yet. At first, people blamed timing, then the workload, then each other. I watched this unfold from inside quietly, without satisfaction or guilt. What I felt was distance, the kind that allows you to observe without needing to intervene. One afternoon, a teammate messaged me asking if I remembered why a certain workflow had been structured the way it was. I explained briefly. No history lesson, no alternative suggestions, just the answer to the question asked. A few days later, someone else asked a similar question. Same system, different angle. I answered again, just as narrowly. The pattern was becoming visible to me, even if it wasn't to them yet. They weren't losing information. They were losing continuity. Things that had once felt intuitive now required discussion. Decisions that used to land quickly needed follow-ups. confidence started to soften at the edges. Not panic, uncertainty. And uncertainty has a way of spreading quietly. Leadership began scheduling more check-ins. Status updates grew longer. Documentation was requested retroactively, after issues had already surfaced. The machine was compensating for the friction it didn't yet understand. No one pointed at me. That's important. When systems fail slowly, blame diffuses. It attaches to process, to circumstance, to growing pains. By the time anyone considers individuals, the moment for clean attribution has passed. I remained calm, helpful when asked, absent when not. My role hadn't changed on paper, but my position in the flow of work had shifted decisively. There was a meeting where someone said, half-jokingly, "We used to be so much faster." No one replied. The room moved on. Another time, a manager commented that certain issues felt harder than they should be. Again, no response. What they were feeling was the absence of invisible labor, the kind that doesn't get planned, budgeted, or acknowledged, but makes everything feel easier when it exists. I didn't feel vindicated watching this. I felt confirmed that my earlier instincts had been right, that my silence hadn't caused the imbalance. It had revealed it, that what I had been providing wasn't just output, but cohesion. And cohesion, once gone, is difficult to recreate intentionally. As my resignation date approached, I noticed something else. People began asking me future-oriented questions. Are you going to be involved in this next phase? Do you think this approach will scale? Can you take a look at this when you have time? Questions that assumed continuity. I answered carefully, I won't be here for that phase. I don't have enough context to say. My availability is limited. Each response landed softly, but together they began to shift the room's temperature. People started recalibrating, not emotionally, but operationally. They realized slowly that something was ending. Still no confrontation, still no drama. The consequences were not punishment, they were physics. Remove a stabilizing force quietly enough, and systems don't collapse, they wobble, and wobble creates cost, time, energy, focus. By the time leadership scheduled a broader review to tighten alignment, I had already submitted my notice, professionally, respectfully, without explanation beyond the standard language. I watched the email thread unfold from a place of surprising neutrality. This wasn't about them realizing what they'd lost. It was about me realizing I'd already let go. By the time anyone tried to fix things, the shape of the problem had already changed. It started with concern, not panic. A few leadership meetings were added to calendars. Language shifted subtly, from confidence to curiosity. People began asking questions that used to be answered instinctively. The tone wasn't accusatory, it was confused. Confusion is often the first sign that an invisible system has failed. I was invited to a meeting with 2 managers and someone from leadership. The invitation was framed as a check-in. Nothing urgent, nothing alarming. I accepted, already knowing what it was about. They asked how I was feeling about my role, whether I felt supported, whether there was anything I needed. It was the first time in years anyone had asked those questions directly. I answered honestly but minimally. I said I was grateful for the experience, that I'd learned a lot, that I was ready for the next chapter. I didn't list grievances, I didn't recount moments, I didn't explain the imbalance, not because I couldn't, but because it was no longer relevant. One of them mentioned how much institutional knowledge I carried. Another said my work had always been quietly critical. The words were careful, almost reverent, as if naming the thing might bring it back. They asked if there was any way I'd consider staying on longer. Maybe transitioning into a different role. Maybe helping document processes more thoroughly. I listened, I nodded. I thanked them for the offer, and I said no. Not sharply, not emotionally, just clearly. What struck me most was not their disappointment, but their surprise. They had assumed, right up until that moment, that I would accommodate, that I would help them fix what was now inconvenient, that my loyalty, once activated, would override my own timeline. They were wrong. The offers that followed were well-intentioned and late. A title adjustment, a future conversation about growth, vague assurances that things could be different. I didn't negotiate. Negotiation requires trust that the other party will honor change beyond urgency. I no longer had that trust, and I didn't resent them for it. The system had taught me what to expect. After that meeting, the tone shifted again. People became quieter around me, more cautious, as if they were trying to memorize something before it disappeared. Questions became more frequent, but less focused. There was a sense of scrambling, not for solutions, but for transfer. You can't transfer years of context in a few weeks. They tried anyway. Workshops were scheduled, documents were requested, processes were mapped hurriedly. But without the underlying understanding of why things were the way they were, it all felt mechanical. I did what I could within reason. I answered questions. I shared what was appropriate. I didn't withhold, but I didn't overextend. The imbalance had already been acknowledged. Correcting it now would have required rewriting history, not just adjusting workload. On my last day, there was a small send-off. Polite, warm. People thanked me for my contributions. Someone said, "We didn't realize how much you did." I smiled and said, "That happens." And it does. Organizations often don't recognize value until it becomes absent. By then, appreciation is no longer currency, it's commentary. As I walked out of the building for the final time, I didn't feel victorious. I felt complete. The chapter had closed cleanly, without confrontation, without bitterness. Fixing it had been possible once. Now it was simply too late. The confrontation, if it can even be called that, didn't happen in a conference room. It happened over coffee, a week after my last day. One of the senior managers I'd worked with for years reached out. The message was polite, almost hesitant. He said he wanted to understand, not to convince me to come back, but to get perspective. I agreed, mostly out of respect for the history we shared. We sat across from each other in a quiet cafe. No laptops, no agendas. Just two people who had occupied the same system from very different angles. He started by saying, "I think we underestimated you." There was no defensiveness in his voice, no attempt to soften the statement, just observation. I nodded. He asked why I hadn't said anything sooner. Why hadn't he pushed harder? Why I hadn't made it clear how much responsibility I carried. I took a moment before answering, not to calculate, but to stay honest. "I did speak," I said, "just not loudly, and after a while I noticed what happened when I did." He frowned slightly, processing that. I explained that I had learned the system's language, that volume mattered more than consistency, that urgency created attention, that quiet reliability created expectation, not leverage. I didn't accuse, I didn't list names, I described dynamics. He listened without interrupting. When I mentioned that I had taken on external consulting work before leaving, his expression shifted, not to anger, but to realization. He didn't ask for details. He didn't need them. "So you were already gone," he said softly. "Yes," I replied, "internally." There was a long pause. He admitted that the company had relied on me more than they had realized, that my silence had been interpreted as satisfaction, that they assumed loyalty meant alignment. "And did it?" he asked. "Mean alignment?" I shook my head. "It meant endurance." That seemed to land. I told him I didn't regret my decision, but I also didn't resent the company. Systems evolve around incentives, not intentions. No one had set out to sideline me. They had simply optimized for comfort. He asked if there was anything they could have done differently. "Yes," I said, "but not at the end." That was the closest thing to a confrontation we had. No raised voices, no apologies demanded. Just clarity exchanged too late to change the outcome. When we stood to leave, he thanked me for my work, for my honesty, for meeting him at all. I thanked him back, genuinely. There was no closure in the dramatic sense, just understanding. As I walked away, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because I had been validated, but because I hadn't needed to be. The conversation confirmed what I already knew. I hadn't been invisible because I lacked presence. I had been invisible because invisibility was convenient. And convenience, once challenged, reveals the truth quickly. That was the last conversation I had with anyone from that company. It didn't change the past, but it confirmed that leaving quietly had been the right choice. I don't introduce myself the same way anymore. Not because my work has changed dramatically, but because my relationship to it has. I no longer define myself by how useful I am to systems that didn't design space for me. I define myself by how intentionally I choose where my effort goes. After I left, there was a quiet period, intentional, necessary. I didn't rush into anything. I let the adrenaline drain. I let the narrative settle. I paid attention to how my body felt without constant low-grade vigilance. What surprised me most was how calm I was. Not numb, not detached, just steady. I took on work where the scope was explicit, and compensation matched responsibility. Where silence wasn't mistaken for consent. And boundaries weren't treated as friction. I spoke when I had something to say. I stayed quiet when I didn't. Both were choices now, not defaults. The money mattered, of course. Stability always does. But what mattered more was the internal alignment. The absence of that familiar tension, the one that comes from knowing you're carrying more than you're acknowledged for. I'm still observant, still calm, still not the loudest person in the room. That part of me didn't disappear. What changed is that I no longer confuse restraint with self-erasure. I've learned that systems don't reward morality. The reward structure. If you don't understand the structure you're inside, your values will be used against you, not maliciously but efficiently. That understanding didn't make me cynical, it made me precise. I don't romanticize what I did. I don't tell this story to encourage betrayal or glorify silence as manipulation. Silence is neutral. It becomes ethical or unethical depending on why you use it and what you protect while doing so. For me, silence became a way to exit without damage to myself or others. It allowed me to correct an imbalance without demanding recognition from people who didn't know how to give it. I still believe in loyalty, just not blind loyalty. Loyalty that requires self-neglect isn't a virtue, it's erosion. Now, when I sense that familiar pull, to overfunction, to smooth things over, to make myself indispensable, I pause. I ask a different question. Is this mutual? If the answer is no, I adjust. I don't wait for permission to protect my future. I don't confuse patience with stagnation. And I don't assume that being good will automatically make me safe. What I carry forward from that chapter isn't resentment, it's discernment. I know now that quiet people are often watching far more than they're credited for. And that underestimation, while painful at first, can become leverage if handled responsibly. I didn't become someone else after I left. I became clearer. When people hear this story, they often want a verdict. They want to know whether what I did was right or wrong, whether the company deserved it, whether I crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed. I understand the impulse. Clear morals feel safer than uncomfortable nuance. But life rarely offers clean conclusions. What I know now is this. Systems don't collapse because of one decision. They drift because of many small ones, most of them invisible, most of them justified in the moment. My decision didn't create the imbalance. It responded to one that had already been normalized. I didn't act out of anger. I didn't act to punish anyone. I acted because I understood, finally, that staying silent out of loyalty had quietly trained the system to expect my sacrifice without question. An expectation once set rarely dissolves on its own. There's a version of this story where I speak up louder, where I fight harder, where I demand recognition and force a correction. That version makes sense on paper. It also assumes that systems respond to truth the way individuals do. They don't. Systems respond to pressure, incentive, and timing. By the time I fully understood the structure I was inside, the only ethical leverage left to me was exit, done cleanly, deliberately, without spectacle. That's the part people struggle with. Silence feels passive, but silence can also be a boundary, a refusal to continue participating in an imbalance you didn't create and can't correct alone. I didn't sell secrets. I sold understanding. Understanding that had been earned through years of responsibility without protection. Understanding that the market was valued clearly, even if my own company hadn't known how to. The money wasn't the victory, the clarity was. What I hope you take from this isn't permission to betray trust or justify harm. It's an invitation to look more closely at where your loyalty flows, and whether it flows back. Ask yourself who benefits from your silence. Ask yourself whether being the reliable one has become your entire identity. Ask yourself whether patience is moving you forward, or simply keeping you in place. Sometimes the most powerful move isn't confrontation. It isn't exposure, it isn't revenge. Sometimes it's choosing not to explain yourself to systems that were never listening. I'm at peace with what I did because I know why I did it, and I know what it protected. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever realized, too late, or just in time, that your loyalty was being mistaken for permission? Tell me in the comments.
Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã theo dõi đến cuối. Đừng quên ấn like, share và bật chuông để không bỏ lỡ những video mới nhất nhé. Hẹn gặp lại.